if my co-webmasters could just introduce themselves real quick, and then we'll introduce our presenters.
Hi, I think David pretty much covered everything. I'm Shane Gleason at Texas A&M University at Corpus Christi. And along with David and Allison, we've been revamping things, and we're really excited to do these brown bags. We have another one coming up in about a month. You'll see that on the listserv and social media shortly. That one will cover the question of immigration, law, and politics. So that one's towards the end of July. And I'll turn it over to Allison.
Hey everybody, I'm Allison Trochesset. I'm the non-academic, I guess, on the panel. I am a court research associate at the National Center for State Courts. And so, like they said, if you haven't already followed us on social media, we're on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
Super. Thanks, guys. And now I think we'll turn things over to our presenters. We have 3 papers on public opinion, and our discussant is Michael Nelson. I figure we can just go in the order that things were listed in the program. So first up, we have Reagan Dobbs, who's going to talk to us about perception of government symbols, comparisons across the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Oh, hang on, Reagan. Sorry, sure. I need to hit record real quick. I'm sorry, I forgot to do that.
Oh, David, I already started the recording for you.
Oh, all right, thanks.
Yep. Cool. All right, just a second. Screen. Okay, going to assume everyone can see my slides. Oh. All right. Well, hi everyone. Good morning, at least over here. My name is Reagan Dobbs. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Merced, and today I'm really excited to share some work with you on a chapter of my dissertation. So, this being a brown bag, this is definitely the perfect stage for receiving feedback for this chapter. The results that I'm presenting are from a very recent pilot study using undergraduate students. And this chapter is going to heavily inform some approaches that I take to later empirical chapters. So really, any comments and suggestions are very much appreciated at this stage. As the slide before you suggests, today I'm presenting some of my recent work that studies government symbols across all 3 branches of the United States federal government. What I mean specifically by government symbols are those that are officially used by and associated with the federal government. So like what you see before you, things like the buildings that where the incumbents do their, what actually house the branch, the interior of those buildings where the incumbents do their work physically, like offices, like the Oval Office, as well as the official seals that are featured by each institution. These are fairly common objects in the news and in everyday political life, so much so that we might not actually think about them until our attention is brought directly to them. And it's because of how common they are that I think it's very important to study them. And there's good reason to believe that they might matter to political life. At least scholars of judicial politics have long recognized this, this kind of phenomenon. Symbols of judicial authority, things like the temple-like building, robes, and gavels are often part of the explanation of how the Supreme Court sustains its legitimacy as an institution. These symbols are interwoven with the myth of legality, or contributing to this idea that justices make decisions on the basis of these fair, neutral legal principles, and what distinguishes them from the other branches of government. And more directly, positivity theory suggests that as people are exposed to these symbols when they learn about the courts, it bolsters the legitimacy of the institution and can explain why people would acquiesce to decisions that they may not like or they might disagree with. But a natural question following from this literature is this completely unique to judicial symbols? So do symbols of the other institutions matter, like legislative symbols and executive symbols? And if they do matter, then how is this? How do they matter, and is this different? So an underlying assumption to the approach that I just outlined with the myth of legality and positivity theory that's been suggested in the judicial politics literature is that since the legislative and executive branches have things that are lacked by the judiciary, like enforcement powers and the electoral connection, maybe symbols just aren't as much needed. Maybe they're not as important. And I think there's a good bit of truth to that idea. Symbols are definitely important, and I think and particularly unique in sustaining the court's legitimacy. But it strikes me as very unlikely that these other symbols and these other branches don't matter at all. Buildings of each branch are found in our textbooks that we as scholars use whenever we're teaching undergraduates. They're also in K through 12 education, and they're very common in the news. They're the sites of very important events like inaugurations. They're places of protest. Americans commonly see the president working at his desk in the Oval Office. They see members of Congress debating legislation and holding hearings inside their chambers, like the House floor. So the news, incumbents, and the public at least act as if these symbols matter to some extent. And there may be a more generalizable story about the power of symbols in play that extends beyond the judicial politics context. And that's at the heart of my dissertation. I seek to explain this area of, or explain how symbols work across a broader area, and offer a more generalizable theory about how government symbols are important reinforcers of legitimacy for their respective institutions. And in doing so, this allows me to compare the effects of exposure across institutions. So what I'm not suggesting to this group of law and court scholars is that judicial symbols are not special, so there's no need for torches or pitchforks or anything like that. I'm suggesting that we can learn a lot more about how judicial symbols are special or perhaps unique in conveying legitimacy by directly comparing them to the symbols of other branches. So the research questions that I ask in broad and in this particular chapter are, how do government symbols work to convey legitimacy, and does this process vary across institutions? For example, does the process by which judicial symbols convey legitimacy meaningfully different from how legislative symbols convey legitimacy, for example? In doing so, I offer a broad framework in my dissertation to explain how symbols might confer legitimacy or bring to mind legitimating thoughts about an institution. And I begin with a simple assumption that government symbols work like cues. So they're visual bits of information, or just these kind of very common visual political stimuli that can be used to inform people's judgments whenever they learn about institutions and the decisions that they make. Now, symbols don't inherently mean anything to someone who's not at all familiar with American politics in the slightest. The White House is just a white building, that's all it is. What the information is that is conveyed by these visual stimuli have to be learned, and a lot of this is going to be rooted in political socialization when people in a society learn about their government to begin with. So as Americans learn about government, particularly through this political socialization process, like in textbooks, family, and then reinforced later in the news, they're exposed to its symbols that are inevitably interwoven within the institution, and the symbols that are embedded within it. The actual substance of this information, I argue, comes in two main dimensions. The first of these is power, or thoughts of power that are associated with the symbol. This makes sense because governments provide the very structure to the political world, and they sit at the top of the political hierarchy conveniently. So it makes sense that their symbols might appeal to the authority, strength, or status of the institution, and how the political world is structured. On the other hand, people also consider the matter of how the institution behaves, or perhaps some of its intent. Governments can't rely on force alone, so at least to some extent, they need some kind of appeal to fairness or objectivity, some kind of meaning of process or impartiality that goes into their decision making as well, not just by merit of having power alone. Now, people can choose to obey the government or follow its edicts, or end up agreeing with some of its decisions for either or both reasons, and it's often that both of these are likely in play. Someone can decide to comply with orders simply due to the fact that the government told them to, and they're the body in charge, they're at the top of the hierarchy, that's what the government official said, so be it, they'll adhere. Another reason more commonly cited is that people can decide to comply because they think it's the right thing to do, regardless of whether or not the government told them, or the fact it was the government that told them to do something, they're going to do it simply because they think that there's something just or right about it. So when it comes to the current project, I'm evaluating more directly this third assumption in the chapter of my dissertation, and I examine whether symbols work in these two dimensions that I suggest, so we can better understand what may bring to mind these kinds of self-reinforcing thoughts that can impact people's downstream assessments of how they evaluate the decisions made by institutions. So I ask people directly in a survey how people perceive the symbols themselves. And from this framework, I derive several hypotheses about this assumption about how I think people perceive government symbols in the context of the American federal government with respect to both power and process. When it comes to power, especially at the level of the federal government in the United States, it's likely that people pretty much equally perceive power across all three institutions, the legislative and executive and judicial alike. So it's likely that power is pretty common across the board with pretty minor variation, maybe at the individual level. And by extension, government symbols of all three types, just given their unique unique position at the top of the American political world, they probably bring to mind thoughts of power more frequently than non-government entities, just as a kind of baseline. As for procedural justice, in line with conventional wisdom and previous work, I suggest that judicial symbols will bring to mind more thoughts of justice compared to its more political brethren in the legislative and executive branches. And as an extension, I think that, again, given the unique position of governments and particularly the federal government in the at the top of the political hierarchy, probably brings to mind more thoughts of procedural justice compared to some kind of non-government baseline. So for this specific study, I recruited 200 participants, undergraduates at UC Merced just a few months ago as a pilot in spring 2021. And they were requested to evaluate some images, and this included 3 images for each branch. This included a building, just like the ones you saw before, the interior of that building, as well as a seal. For the purpose of today, just in the interest of time, I'm only going to cover the building and the interior. Happy to talk about anything else if that happens to come up, but this is mostly because I also only have a non-government baseline for the building and the interior. So for the buildings, I use the comparison of Union Station to kind of control for the architectural style of the buildings. This neoclassical architecture featured across all 3 branches. And the interior, I choose kind of a baseline, just regular sort of conference table to kind of control for this decision-making environment. Participants did not see every single image. They were just randomly given a subset of these images. And they only saw one type of symbol per institution. So it was a very brief, kind of quick survey. For each image, participants were asked a question: to what extent does this image make you think about? And then they were given a grid of multiple concepts, including power and justice, as well as some synonyms, just kind of just as a sort of robustness check, as well as some other distractor words and other relevant concepts. But I'm only focusing on power and justice for these particular hypotheses. And the responses in this grid range from not at all to a great deal. Just to show you an example of the images that were used, this includes like the Capitol building, the White House, and Union Station. I took a lot of time trying to make everything look pretty comparable in terms of the time of day and the angle and all the perspective that goes into the images. So one key thing to note is that these were not labeled or identified to participants. So like if they happened to see the Capitol, they were not told it was the Capitol. So theoretically, anything that they bring to mind in terms of their perceptions is just based on what they might think the building is without the actual identification. So right before we get to the data, just to reiterate what my hypotheses would suggest here, just to demonstrate my expectations. When it comes to the judicial, legislative, and executive symbols, I expect pretty comparable results across the board in terms of eliciting thoughts of power compared to a non-government base. And furthermore, that would be higher than a non-government baseline. When it comes to justice, I expect the judiciary to be the highest compared to its brethren in the legislative and executive branches for their particular symbols, and all of those would be higher than a non-government baseline. So for the first analysis of buildings, I find some good support in line of expectations, and the bars that you see are all indicating a significant difference in a t-test at the 0.05 level. And for power, I find that all 3 institutions are perceived pretty similarly in terms of eliciting thoughts of power, not different from one another, but they are all more significant than the baseline image of Union Station whenever it comes to the architectural style of the buildings. And whenever we turn to justice, I find that judicial symbols are the strongest elicitors of thoughts of justice, but the legislative and executive symbols also don't also have this advantage over the non-government baseline. So judicial symbols are quite unique here, it seems, just across the board, and other branches of government don't enjoy this advantage. I find pretty similar results when in terms of interiors with a little bit nuanced kind of interpretations. So for power, the executive branch appears to have the most distinct advantage compared to the others. So the Oval Office, when it comes to the executive branch, compared to the interior of the House floor or the court bench, the executive might have an advantage in terms of power, which, and I have some thoughts as to why that might be the case. And two of the institutions are benefit over just the general conference table. As for justice, the judicial branch again is significant and greatest compared to most of the images, and the legislative branch, interestingly, in line with my expectations, does achieve this advantage in terms of justice over a non-government, just basic kind of conference table image. So taking all of the results together, there's pretty good support for at least for the power hypotheses. Government symbols are mostly perceived similarly in this dimension. They're great elicitors of thoughts of power, although the executive may have an advantage here. This may not be particularly surprising if political socialization really heavily emphasizes the president as the heart of American politics and government, being a very powerful office, at least in the minds of the public. Additionally, across the board, government symbols do elicit thoughts of power more than the non-government baseline, and this finding is almost always significant for each branch. As for the procedural justice hypotheses, judicial symbols appear to be pretty unique compared not only to its brethren, but to a non-government baseline just across the board. So to wrap everything up, there's at least modest support for my hypotheses, which in turn corroborates the assumption that I make in my theoretical approach a little bit earlier in the dissertation about how government symbols may help to perpetuate the legitimacy and the authority that are given to their respective institutions. And this may have consequences for people's downstream assessments of outcomes, not only for judiciaries, but for other branches. But a big key takeaway here is that thoughts of power are indeed conveyed by government symbols, and thoughts of process are a little bit more unique to symbols of the judiciary. And this is something that we're able to learn by comparison. Finally, some implications that may be interesting for future research. One pattern that emerges from the graphs that at least I find is that power seems to be a dominant dimension compared to procedural justice across all three branches. So procedural justice may be unique to the court, but still power seems to be a little bit more relevant, or at least a little bit more relevant in the minds of my participants. So this may suggest that theorizing about judicial symbols is a bit incomplete, because judicial symbols not only convey thoughts about procedural justice, but perhaps in a more dominant sense, power. So one direction for future research, which I conveniently happen to plan for in my dissertation, is comparing the effects of these symbols across institutions to see which of these dimensions might be doing the work to induce acquiescence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reagan. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who's going to talk to us about confirmation hearings. Alex.
Okay, so I want to thank everyone for coming today. It's a great turnout, and I'm really excited to present this research to you all. If you have questions of clarifying nature as I'm going, feel free to type them in the chat. I do have that open on a separate screen, and hopefully I can answer those. If not, we can wait to the question and answer section for more substantive questions. So as David said, my name is Alex Badas, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Houston. Today, I'm going to talk to you guys about how motivated reasoning is going to influence attitudes towards Supreme Court confirmation hearings, and especially the kind of confirmation hearings people want the Senate to be conducting. Right? So just to kind of get everything out at the start, my plan for the talk is to analyze public support for legalistic or politicized Supreme Court confirmation hearings. And I'm going to demonstrate to you that individuals in the mass public engage in motivated reasoning when determining whether they want to see the Senate conduct legalistic or politicized confirmation hearings. Right? And what I mean by legalistic confirmation hearings are confirmation hearings that mostly stick to the nominees' qualifications, their kind of understanding of the law. So basically, are they an originalist? Questions like that. What kind of experience do they have that will allow them to excel in the position of Supreme Court Justice? And when I'm thinking about politicized confirmation hearings, I'm asking about questions that kind of get at the heart of the nominees' political beliefs. Do you think Roe versus Wade was appropriately decided? Are you supportive of affirmative action or not? And can you explain why you have those preferences? Right? And I think this is an important question to answer, because the confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court are one of the most public events involving the Supreme Court. So as we kind of think about how the public understands the Supreme Court and perceives the Supreme Court, well, these are events that capture the public's attention a lot. So this kind of salience around confirmation hearings gives us a nice context to study attitudes toward the Supreme Court, right? Even kind of the most salient decisions will kind of be in the news cycle for a week. But if we look at confirmation hearings, these typically last, a few weeks at a time. So the public is really attentive to the Supreme Court at this point in time. And to kind of, start the motivation for this, we have to kind of think about how the Supreme Court is presented in kind of, just the general public, right? There's a dual nature to the Supreme Court. On one hand, the Supreme Court is a legalistic institution, right? It creates legal rules and procedures that other institutions have to follow. They resolve disagreement in the lower courts, trying to provide legal clarity for the lower courts to follow. And as the Supreme Court does this, they all present themselves in a legalistic, apolitical fashion, right? So they write judicial opinions that are couched in legal language. When they are disagreements, they claim their disagreements are based on law and not political beliefs. And again, they justify their decisions with legalistic sources. So this is what the Constitution requires. This is what the statute requires actors to do, rather than, I think this is a good idea because I'm a Democrat, or this is a good idea because I'm a Republican, right? But on the other hand, right, we're all political scientists, so we know that the Supreme Court is also a political institution. The justices are motivated by their own partisanship or ideologies. They're selected by political institutions, right? So the president is thinking about politics when they select nominees. The Senate is also thinking about politics when they confirm nominees. Outside of this, the decisions have major political implications and consequences, and the justices themselves engage in strategic maneuvering to arrive at the desired outcome. So as we kind of see public discussions of the Supreme Court, we see that these two ideas, or these two presentations of the court, are often kind of in the fore, and there's tensions between them. And what kind of perception the mass public has may have important consequences for the Supreme Court. And again, we know that there are implications for this, right? If you perceive the court as a legalistic institution, you tend to view the court with more trust, more legitimacy, greater perceptions of procedural fairness. But when you perceive the court as a political institution, this decreases trust, decreases legitimacy, and diminishes perceptions of procedural fairness. So understanding how the public kind of views the court in this duality presentation is really important for these implications here. And the majority of research treats beliefs about whether the court is legal or political as kind of orthogonal to other motivations, right? It kind of takes the idea that people have these views that are independent of the actions the court is taking, right? So we maybe just think, I was trained in my high school to think of the court as a legalistic institution. That's just what I was taught, so that's what I'm going to carry with me, and that's going to be my kind of static belief throughout my life. Or maybe they took a class with one of us and understand that the court's a political institution, and they really hang on to that throughout their lives, and anytime they're asked, they're going to say the court is a political institution, right? But what we know from probably at this point 80 years of public opinion research is the mass public does not have stable attitudes or beliefs about political institutions. Instead, these beliefs are dynamic and really based on the circumstances that we're asking about, and they're going to change depending on the exact situations and the exact details of a particular incident. And if we kind of expand this idea that people don't have really don't have stable beliefs about the Supreme Court or political institutions directly to the Supreme Court, so in previous research, I found that individuals tend to perceive the court as a legalistic institution when the court makes decisions that they agree with, right? So in a way, they kind of see the court as legitimizing their beliefs. So they want to kind of perceive the court as a legal institution because it validates their existing beliefs as legalistic in nature, which has more credibility than just your everyday political belief. But when people disagree with the Supreme Court, they tend to see the court as a political institution, right? They want to delegitimize the court in a way that helps them maintain the legitimacy of their policy preferences, right? So that's some previous research I did on just perceiving the court as legal or political. And I want to kind of expand this research to how people think the confirmation hearings should be conducted. Right, so I'm going to apply the motivated reasoning framework to understand preferences towards confirmation hearings. And for those who are not really familiar with motivated reasoning, there's kind of two types of motivated reasoning. This talk will focus mostly on goal-oriented motivated reasoning. So in goal-oriented motivated reasoning, people have a preferred result, and they're going to construct evidence or preferences for themselves that best allow them to achieve that result, right? So if I want a particular nominee confirmed, I'm going to kind of favor procedures, or I'm going to favor principles that will help that nominee get confirmed. Right? And again, this is just a very important question to ask, because the confirmation hearings are the most public events surrounding the Supreme Court. The confirmation hearings themselves highlight this dual role of the Supreme Court. We have examples of senators asking legalistic questions and politicized questions, right? So we may think back to the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, where one of the senators asked her to name the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. That's a legalistic approach to the confirmation hearings. And on the other hand, some senators asked her about her attitudes towards Roe versus Wade. And that's an example of a politicized confirmation hearing. They're trying to drive her policy preferences. And as we see that Senate hearings kind of unfold, there's a lot of debate about what is the most appropriate way to conduct these hearings. Right? As we'll see in the next talk, a lot of people think that the Senate confirmation hearings have kind of devolved into just a lot of partisan nonsense that don't really kind of provide the public with any information about nominees or the Supreme Court that's meaningful. But maybe this is exactly what the public wants. Maybe they want this politicized process. Right? So I think this is an important question to answer. So if we kind of use the motivated reasoning framework here, we're just going to come to the conclusion that people are going to support the procedure that is most beneficial to their preferred outcome. Right? So if you want a nominee to be confirmed, you favor that nominee being confirmed, you're going to want a legalistic confirmation hearing. And that's because in our current context, almost all nominees are well qualified and have the appropriate experience. And if the confirmation hearing is just conducted on this legalistic dimension, every nominee should be easily confirmed, right? We maybe have one example where President Bush nominated Harriet Miers and she wasn't perceived as qualified, but that nomination was withdrawn. Right? So I think the kind of modern context, most nominees will be seen as universally qualified. This is because they come from, most of them come from the circuit court. They have a lot of experience. Typically, they're rated very highly by the American Bar Association. So it's not like unqualified individuals are being nominated. But if we kind of flip this and you don't want a nominee to be confirmed, you want them to be rejected, well, you understand that if it's a debate about legal qualifications, you're likely to lose. So what you need to do is to engage in motivated reasoning and have a desire to activate a second dimension. And because we have this dual nature of the Supreme Court, the natural second dimension is politics, right? And if you're able to hold the confirmation hearing about politics, well, this makes the probability of rejection somewhat higher, right? Because you can at least claim that maybe the nominee is outside of the ideological mainstream, and we can consider the example of Robert Bork for this, right? He was a nominee who was, widely seen as well qualified, had a lot of experience. The American Bar Association rated him somewhat highly, but he was still rejected, right? Because he was kind of seen as an ideologue. So using that template, people want to engage in motivated reasoning to say, this candidate is too ideologically extreme for confirmation. So this is what they're going to open up to once they don't want a nominee confirmed. And there is a little bit of prior research on this, but I'm going to argue that it's limited for various reasons. So Gibson and Caldera, right? They kind of say that, through the positivity theory and judiciousness framework, this creates a context where people want judicial nominees that are going to fulfill the proper role of a judge, right? And we can kind of maybe assume that this proper role of a judge is to be concerned about legalistic criteria, legalistic qualifications, although Gibson and Caldera do not test this directly, right? They use different questions. So it's somewhat limited in that sense. One, there's no direct test for process beliefs. They're not asking people if they want a legalistic or politicized confirmation hearing. And two, it's their analysis is limited to just one nominee, the context of Alito. So if we really want to kind of have a general theory of how the public is going to form preferences about nominees, we want to analyze as many nominees as we possibly can. And then Bartels and Johnston have an article in 2012 about this, right? And they find that a majority of the public does support a politicized confirmation hearing. And this is especially true of those who are aware of political polarization. But there's limitations to this research as well. One, they just ask general questions about confirmation hearings. There's no nominee pending at the time, so they can't ask about nominees. So how individuals feel about particular nominees, they're unable to answer this question, right? And it's just, again, a one-off survey. We don't have kind of data across multiple events. So I want to kind of expand upon this and find greater research by, one, analyzing as many confirmation hearings as I can, and two, analyzing actual confirmation hearings where there's a pending nominee that individuals have preferences about. So I searched the Roper polling archives for surveys asking about preferences for legalistic or politicized confirmation hearings. And I get a whole host of different kind of questions. Typically, the most common ones are, how important is it that the Senate considers the nominees' qualifications? This is an example of a legalistic question. And then another question would be, how important is it that the Senate considers the nominees' political views? Again, this would be an example of a politicized confirmation question. And then they also ask a few questions about, should the Senate consider the nominees' positions on controversial issues such as abortion, sometimes affirmative action. So I find all the data sets that involve questions about these, and also include questions about whether individuals support or oppose nominees, or favor nominees, or have unfavorable attitudes towards nominees. And so through my search, I find results for 5 nominees: Roberts, Alito, Sotomayor, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. So the nominees, there's some missing, and that's not because I'm selectively presenting evidence. There's just no data that include Kagan and the earlier nominees here. So my dependent variable is going to be preference for politicized confirmation hearings. And for most nominees, this is a multi-item battery. So when there was multiple categories, I used factor analysis to create a scale. And the factor analysis demonstrated that this is a unidimensional concept. So we may kind of think of this as being a multi-dimensional concept where you have preference for legalistic confirmation hearings on one dimension, and then preferences for a politicized confirmation hearing as its own dimension. But it seems like all these items scale pretty well together to form one single dimension. And even if I analyze each question individually, all of my results substantively hold. Right? And for Alito and Sotomayor, there's just a single item asking, how important is it to consider the nominees' political beliefs? So for them, it's just a more limited question. And I rescale all of the dependent variables I created to range between 0 and 1, just for some sake of comparability across the models I'm going to run. And my main independent variable of interest is attitudes towards the nominee. Again, there's going to be a mixture of questions that capture support for nominees. Some of these are a simple dichotomy. Would you support the nominee being confirmed, or would you oppose them being confirmed? Some of these are a favorability for category question, very favorable, favorable, somewhat unfavorable, very unfavorable. And again, I rescale all these between 0 and 1. Ideally, we'd have the same questions across each nomination, but unfortunately, because the nature of the data collection process, that's not possible. And then all the models I'm going to present here include some kind of demographic controls and also some form of presidential support. And then again, because I'm relying on existing data, some of this is going to be patchwork to use available controls that we may think are required when they're available. So some of the models will control for court knowledge. Some of them will control for court competence, perceptions of a political court, and understanding of polarization, which Bartels and Johnson saw as very important. So it's just kind of a patchwork approach here, trying to create the most complete models I can with the data at hand. And here are the results for the 5 models, and I'm just running an OLS regression model predicting whether people support this politicized confirmation hearing or not. So higher values would indicate that you support a politicized confirmation hearing. Lower values would indicate you support a legalistic confirmation hearing. And we see when you support or favor a nominee, you're much less likely to want this polarized or politicized confirmation hearing. You want the candidates, the Senate, to stick to legal qualifications rather than asking them about abortion or affirmative action. You want to know what's their mode of statutory interpretation. Results across 5 nominees support the theory that individuals who support a nominee want a legalistic confirmation hearing. Those who oppose a nominee want this politicized confirmation hearing. And I think this is best explained through motivated reasoning. And further, across 4 of the models, nominee support is actually the strongest predictor for preferences of a legalistic confirmation hearing. So it seems like it's doing a lot of work just beyond the kind of, being statistically significant. It's also one of the largest magnitudes of the effect. But of course, we can maybe come up with counter arguments and try to explain my results away. The observational results may be somewhat limited by concerns of endogeneity. I'm going to say that really, really slow. And this may be because people favor nominees because they favor legalistic procedures. So maybe it's not that people support these nominees and then want a legalistic procedure, but maybe people support legalistic procedures. All of our nominees are well qualified, therefore I support these nominees. Well, if we look at existing research that seeks to explain why people support or oppose Supreme Court nominations, this research doesn't really lend any support to that idea. What we know about why people support nominees or don't support nominees is mostly they support nominees that align with them on partisan grounds, ideological grounds. And in an article with Caitlin Stauffer, I find that there's some kind of room for race, gender, ethnicity to matter a little bit. So if you look at existing studies, it seems like this is not the case, right? It seems like this is probably the story I'm telling is one where you support a nominee, then you support these legalistic procedures as a result. But I still want to rule this out, right? I want to have a lot of confidence in my results. So I'm going to field an experiment to try to answer this problem that I'm having. And what I do is I create a pre-post-test design, and I field this to Amazon's Mechanical Turk. I take kind of appropriate measures to ensure data quality. This includes VPN screeners, making sure everyone only takes the survey one time, and my N is 500. So at the beginning of the survey, I asked participants their preferences towards legalistic or politicized confirmation hearings. I asked them 2 questions. So one is, how important is it that the Senate considers the qualifications of a nominee, the legalistic qualifications? The second question asks about how important it is that the Senate asks nominees questions about their political beliefs. Then what I do is I present, after they answer these questions, they go through a survey that includes really a lot of distraction questions to kind of get their mind off the Supreme Court, just so there's no demand effects that they answer the questions in the same way on the very next page. So after they go through all the screener questions, participants are presented a random nominee profile. So basically I just created a conjoint experiment that's going to vary, I think, 5 or 6 qualities of a nominee totally randomly. And this is just to create a nominee to them that is completely orthogonal to their initially stated preferences, right? So they answer the questions about what kind of confirmation hearing they prefer. Now they're presented with a totally orthogonal nominee, and then I'm going to ask them these questions again. Right? So after they view that totally orthogonal profile, they're asked attitudes towards that nominee. So do you favor or oppose this nominee? And then they're asked the questions about supporting a legalistic or politicized confirmation hearing again. And they're targeted about this specific nominee, right? So we can see how their attitudes towards a politicized confirmation hearing changes once they're presented a nominee that maybe they oppose or maybe they support. Right? So my DV here is going to be the change in support for politicized confirmation hearings. And the key independent variable is going to be favorability towards the nominee presented in that random profile. And here are the results to the experiment. We see that when they have a very unfavorable attitude towards the nominee, their support for that politicized confirmation hearing increases. When there's a very favorable attitude towards that nominee, the support for that politicized confirmation hearing decreases, right? So again, this kind of aligns with my theoretical expectations and further validates the observational results. Happy to see that the experiment validates the observational studies. Maybe this lessens the concern for endogeneity. Participants update their attitudes for this confirmation process based on their attitudes towards the nominees. So I think there's a lot of implications for this study. So it's further evidence of motivated reasoning and how people formulate their attitudes towards the Supreme Court, towards judicial institutions. So this kind of builds off some of my prior research and some others' research. And I think when it has further implications for how we kind of present and think about the Supreme Court as this dual institution, right? Again, much of the research on public attitudes towards the Supreme Court take these views as orthogonal to other motivations. What I show here, and again in the prior research, is that that's not really the case. And we need to think about how all the events that we're also interested in may be influencing these beliefs, right? And I think if we kind of think deeper about this, the results really indicate that the decision to view the court as a legal or political institution is itself a political calculation where people are kind of coming up with justifications or motivations that allow them to best advance their policy or political preferences. So people are not viewing the Supreme Court as a legal institution necessarily because they think it's a legalistic institution. They understand that viewing it as a legalistic institution maybe gives greater credibility to their policy preferences. And then maybe if we're kind of thinking about the debate over, well, is this the most appropriate confirmation hearing to have, right? Right, I think Elena Kagan called it a charade, and a lot of other people have been very critical of it. Well, if we look at public attitudes for this, we're sort of justified in the current process, right? Constituents are sort of getting what they want. There's a mixture of demand. Some people want a politicized confirmation hearing. Some people want this legalistic confirmation hearing, even based on their preference towards the nominees. So senators are just sort of delivering back to people what they want. So I think it's hard to think of reforming the process because, well, the public and the constituencies are sort of demanding this sort of action. So I hope you enjoyed the talk. Hopefully I didn't go over time too much. I'm happy to answer questions later in the panel, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Very interesting research. For our final paper, we have work by Amanda Bryan, Maren Sorensen, and Rachel Houston, also on the confirmation process. So I think we have Rachel with us to make the presentation.
Can y'all see this? Okay, awesome. Hey everyone, my name is Rachel Houston. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota, and along with Amanda Bryan and Maren Sorensen, we're presenting our paper on confirmation processes, focusing on Barrett and Kavanaugh's confirmations and the role that Twitter plays in these processes. So we know that the political din over Kavanaugh and Barrett's confirmations featured very similar overheated partisan rhetoric of previous legendary confirmation fights, thinking about Clarence Thomas as an example. But this time, you know, we are in 2021 now. Instead of the public having to go and, you know, complain or voice their concerns in newspaper editorials or to their neighbors, this time for both of these confirmations, the public could speak about them through 280 characters at a time on Twitter. So this is a very unique development that now the public gets to use social media to voice their concerns or voice their support for these confirmations. And so when we started this project, we kind of wanted to look through some of these tweets, right? What are people saying about these confirmations? Shelby at the top left, you know, said regarding Kavanaugh, another rapist on the SCOTUS. The one bottom left says an illegitimate court still makes the fucking rules. On the right, we have, I hope RBG has haunting powers. And then Republicans owe the Democrats nothing. Confirm Amy Coney Barrett. So when we went through these tweets, we realized very early on that people have very charged emotions about these confirmations, both positively and negatively. So we argue that through people using Twitter to talk about the Supreme Court and its confirmation processes, these attacks on the court challenge the court's required role as an apolitical institution, as we all know. So looking at the polling data on how the public responds to these confirmations, we know that there is this downward trend line in the court's approval that began first in the 1970s, and it's become more pronounced in the 2000s. With this downward trend, there are some peaks and valleys. And so the public tends to respond very positively to nomination and confirmation events, and then negatively to court decisions that they disagree with, that diverge from individual or mass public opinion. So Bush v. Gore, you know, public opinion went down a little bit, but it jumped right back up. And so we have some polling data for exactly how the public was responding during Kavanaugh's confirmation and Barrett's. So during Kavanaugh's confirmation, we know that approval dipped just slightly 2 percentage points, which, you know, probably isn't a big deal. But once we break that down, approval dropped amongst women and both with Democrats and Republicans. So women's approval dropped from 48% to 43% from Gallup, and then Democrats and Republicans both dropped a couple percentage points, which I have right here. We don't have these same questions yet from Gallup for Barrett's confirmation. However, we have several other polling questions that do suggest that people are using their partisan lenses and their gender, their gender to decide, whether they're going to support a nominee. So Barrett received slim majority support at 51%, but once we break this down by partisanship, you can see 89% of Republicans approved it, 15% did not. And then you see that women, disapproved of it more than men. So together, this polling data does show that there is a polarized electorate that is paying attention to what is happening on the court in terms of court membership. And they're using their partisan and gender fault lines to determine whether they are, wanting, Barrett or Kavanaugh on the bench. And so bringing this back to political science literature, we know that the public is increasingly viewing the court just broadly through these partisan perceptual screens that have normally been reserved for partisan politics. So, how we view our representatives, for example. And so we see in this realm that the public is altering its perceptions of the court based upon factors completely outside of the court's control, such as its membership here. And so looking at the Twitter literature, there's also literature to suggest that the public does pay attention to what's going on in politics. So the polling data suggests that the public is, listening and, making decisions about the confirmations. The Twitter literature suggests that the public does engage in political events and they do respond to these political events. Political event sentiment tends to be negative on Twitter just broadly when speaking about presidential debates and elections. And partisans tend to engage on Twitter with content that aligns with their partisanship, of course. And users also pay attention to what is going on in the news. So an example, it was just, a really small news story, but former President Trump wore a mask at Walter Reed last year, and there was an increased mask-related engagement on Twitter and a lot of positive sentiment of people interacting with that small, tiny event. So users on Twitter are paying attention to what's going on, and they are paying attention to the confirmation processes. So based on this literature and the polling data, we have two expectations. The first is that Twitter users are going to pay attention to each stage of the confirmation process. So starting with the retirement or the death of a justice and extending all the way to when they are confirmed. We also expect that the public is going to respond to these processes with this highly charged negative and positive language based on their partisanship. So when their party is perceived as winning, they'll respond positively. But when their party is perceived as losing, they're going to respond very negatively. So to do this, we collect all sorts of tweets. We collect these tweets through a spreadsheet program called Tags. It gathers tweets through the Twitter search API, which is a nightmare. But we use this API tool to search for various terms at 5 distinct time periods in each confirmation. So you can see for both Kavanaugh and Barrett, we collected tweets for the departure of the justice prior to them. So we also collected tweets once Trump announced both nominees. We collected tweets at the debate stage. The first presidential debate, Barrett was a huge topic, so we collected tweets for that. Both confirmations, we collected tweets. For Kavanaugh, we collected tweets on the assault hearings. And then finally, once both justices were confirmed, we collected tweets a couple days in that range. So in total, we collected over 4.1 million tweets for Barrett's process and more than 1.6 million for the Kavanaugh process. We also looked through and coded for partisanship for a small portion of these users. So 2% of the users for Kavanaugh and 4% for Barrett. We had a group of RAs that coded and looked at each person's Twitter page and decided with the bio content, the profile picture, and the top 10 posts, if they could identify the partisanship, which, you know, it was pretty clear that most people had, you know, Make America Great Again, or, you know, all sorts of partisan language that made it clear for these RAs to code. Based on prior literature, we do exclude retweets because it's the same voice being, you know, enforced over and over. So if a tweet has like 20,000 retweets, you know, it's the same thing being spread 20,000 times. So we did not want to use retweets. So the first thing we do, we look at the top 25 Twitter hashtags by nominee. And so it's clear from this, you can see that the partisanship is already in this before we break it down by partisanship. For Kavanaugh, some of the top hashtags were Make America Great Again, Me Too, Trump, Fox News, Resist, GOP, Delay the Vote. And then for Barrett, we have very similar hashtags. Interestingly, COVID-19 came up, the election was a big deal. So we have Election 2020, Make America Great Again, Trump, Fox News. And so we see these partisan hashtags here even before we break it down by partisanship. And these partisan hashtags seem to make their way in at every stage of the confirmation process for both nominees. So, you know, for the retirement of Kennedy, top hashtags were Trump, Make America Great Again. For the announcement of Kavanaugh, we have Trump, Save SCOTUS, Make America Great Again, Fox News. And so I won't repeat it, but for the confirmation, the sexual assault testimony, and the final vote, I will say for the final vote, we have Vote Blue, GOP, 2A for the Second Amendment. So again, these top hashtags, when people are talking about you know, these now justices, they were using these very partisan hashtags at every stage. And again, the same thing for Barrett. Obviously, RBG is the top hashtag, but we do see more of Trump, of Fox News, Make America Great Again, Trump 2020. And so these were the most popular hashtags people were using as they talked about these now justices. And so then we break this down by the partisan sample that we collected tweets for. So again, that 2% and the 4%. And we see, you know, kind of more extreme hashtags that are very, very partisan. So for Kavanaugh, some top hashtags are Resist, Trump, what are they hiding? Who owns Kavanaugh? Stop Kavanaugh. And for Barrett, you know, similar thing from Democrats. Again, talking about Trump, the election, blocking Barrett, Vote Blue to Save America and Make America Great Again. Kavanaugh, very similar. So hashtag Dems, walk away, hashtag Democrats, hashtag angry Democrat mob. And so the same for Barrett, voting 3 justices, Make America Great Again, Trump 2020. And then, so moving away from hashtags, we wanted to analyze the sentiment of all of these tweets. And so this graph shows the sentiment from all of the tweets before breaking it down by partisanship. So in the left corner, you can see what words people were using as they were talking about these confirmations, including rape, angry, you know, hell, shit, you know, there's a lot of profane language in that corner. When people were talking about the court negatively, or excuse me, these confirmation processes, they were using words like that. However, very positive words as well. So we have support, faithful, hope, true, one. And the same thing for Amy. We have this bottom left corner of very profane language. And then on the right, you know, very positive win, support, hope language being used. And so when we break this down with partisanship considered, we can see that Democrats were using words during Kavanaugh's process like debt, stolen, liar, perjury. And then on the right, Republicans were using words like support, disgrace, attacked. And so these, you know, same thing for Amy Coney Barrett. You know, you have your profane language in there and extreme positive and negative language. And so we find that polarization as manifested in people's Twitter behavior does indeed lead to attacks on the high court. People are talking about the confirmation processes with extreme positive or negative language, depending on you know, how they perceive the nominee benefiting their party or not benefiting their party. So confirmation processes are supposed to give the public this rare chance to see the court since it's behind closed doors, but our findings suggest from the Twitter data that Twitter users are seeing the court largely through their partisan lens and using partisan hashtags and very negative and positive sentiment to talk about these confirmation processes. Although, anyone could just say, this is just Twitter, this does not represent the public, we argue that it actually is a force in American politics, and its meanness is a concerning sign for the court. 1 in 5 Americans have a Twitter account, so this is not a very small sample of the public, nor is it just, a bunch of 20-year-olds or a bunch of trolls. There's a large group of people that are on Twitter, so we should not discount the importance of it. And again, the court, this is very concerning given that the court's survivability as a viable institution is so deeply embedded in the public's goodwill. So based on what we find, it's just extremely emotionally charged language and very partisan hashtags. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Very interesting work you're doing there. Now I'm going to turn it over to Michael Nelson to share some comments on the papers, and then after that we can get to some audience Q&A.
Thank you, David. I made slides, but I'm not going to use them, and I'm going to go super quick because I have typed up comments to all the panelists, and so they're going to get a bunch of feedback from me, but they won't get a bunch of feedback from all of you who heard the presentations. So I'm the least interesting person standing between us and Q&A. This was a really wonderful set of 3 papers to read, and it was amazing how well they kind of gelled together in terms of each of the 3 papers being really interested in the relationship between the public and the court vis-a-vis politicization. And they were all very well written, really easy to follow, and I think, as you saw from the presentations, had some very interesting results. One broad comment to all 3 panelists is to go back to the slides that you used to present the paper, and then go back and read the first 10 pages of your papers, because, and you'll see this in my comments, but the frames that you use to present the papers in the presentations, kind of the way you talked about your paper, in all 3 cases was an improvement, and an even better way to frame the paper than what you've done in the actual paper. And sometimes that happens, just you type one thing, and when you're talking it out, you say what you're actually thinking. And so I think you can make the fronts of the papers stronger if you kind of use the framing that you used in the presentations today. So I'm going to say one thing about each paper, and then I'm going to be quiet. Reagan, it's so wonderful to see somebody actually kicking the wheels on these symbols, because we talk about them all the time. And we just kind of say, like, oh, courts are special because Easton did some stuff with kids in the 1960s, and lots has changed. I think as you work on this paper some more, and this is a counterintuitive comment to give in a court's brown bag, I think you can talk more about legislative and executive symbols. And in particular, you get that interesting results about executive power, executive symbols and power, which immediately brought to mind Neustadt, and like the section of Neustadt that you have to read as a first-year graduate student. And he's talking about the symbols of power in the White House. And Fenno does a lot, like this home style thing with like what legislators are trying to bring to people's minds. So I think there's a lot that you can use as you're explaining what's similar and different about the 3 branches, to make the paper more interesting to people outside of courts. Alex, I really liked the 2 study design in your paper. I think you my big comment for you is I think you sell the paper short in how you've written it up. In particular, you do this great work where you found all these surveys about all these confirmation hearings, and then you kind of throw it under the bus right now when you move to your experiment, and you're just like, there might be endogeneity there. When in actuality, there's a lot that we get from that survey that we can't get from the experiment. There's stuff we can get from the experiment that we can't get from the survey. And I think you would help your reader a lot by saying, you know, these are the pros and cons of the two designs. And when you look at them together, we're getting a really sophisticated picture of what's going on. Rachel, you guys have absolutely incredible data. And you said this in your email to me this morning, and it was kind of my read of the paper too. It's hard to kind of know where to focus. And so I think my advice to you is to maybe the timing piece is, you know, how things change over the course of the hearing, because that's a unique aspect of your data that lots of other data can't get at. And I think, you know, people aren't going to be surprised to know, like, oh, people on Twitter tweeted political things about the confirmation hearings. And so I think you can spend less time trying to establish that and tell us more about the variation. Like, how does this discussion change over time? And how does the relationship between these confirmation events and what people are tweeting have ramifications for what the court's doing? So my advice would be to kind of focus on the timing. So I'm going to stop talking here and let David open it up to Q&A.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Michael. And you know, we'll be sure to send your comments on later. Is there anybody in the audience who wants to engage with our panelists, ask a question? You can either speak up or type it in the chat and I can relay it. I don't know, Reagan, if you saw from Christine Bird, she dropped a note in the chat that Keith Gaddy is doing some work on political architecture.
Yeah, I just saw that and I responded to her individually, but that's super cool and I didn't know that, so thank you. I'm definitely interested in seeing it.
I have a question for you too, Reagan. I also, like Michael, love that you're kicking the wheels, as he said, on the symbols, and I especially love that you're comparing institutions. I'm a little bit worried, though, about the similarity of the look of the institutions and then the conclusion you're drawing that there's a difference between the judicial and the legislative and the executive. And I just wonder if you've done any sort of, you know, check of identification from your subjects? Like, did you ask them, like, which one was the court and which one was the legislature?
Yes, so in the study that I talked about today, after they provided the evaluation on the thoughts of justice and power, then I asked them what they thought the institution was, or what that building was. And so that included 3 options, one for each branch, as well as a don't know, or not listed here. So there is a check on that. Mostly, the White House is by far the most recognizable across the board. Whenever they were asked it in this context, I think the most common source of confusion was between the Capitol and the court. And as a second kind of check on this, it's in the paper, but I did not have time to talk about it. I also have a survey using these same questions where I ask people an open-ended question about what comes to mind when they see that image. And I find kind of similar results where, like, the White House is very recognizable. When people see the White House without prompt, they recognize it. For the most part, that's true for the Capitol, and the court is the least recognizable if they're asked to provide that without a multiple choice question. It's most often confused with the Washington Memorial or the Lincoln Memorial, for example. But,
are you thinking about in future work to label them, or are you opposed to labels?
I think that when it comes to later chapters, these symbols might be accompanied with some kind of an article that would include the context for what that institution is. So probably it will have a label in the sense that the article will be about the court and it'll be a picture of the court, so they'll match. Yeah.
Thanks, Reagan.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Do we have a question from Kirsten?
Yes, thanks so much. My question is for Rachel. Rachel, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was listening to your super interesting presentation was Twitter tends to have a lot more elites than some of our other platforms. And whether you screened to make sure that you were including the general public or whether you might be capturing elite sentiment that then is being echoed by members of the public.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We didn't separate elite tweets necessarily, but that's one of the reasons why we did not include retweets, because we know that, public figures, they get a lot more retweets than, you or me on Twitter. And so that's one approach we went to make sure that if, elites were considered, it was just one tweet. However, we have not broken it up. It would require us to go through every single user of millions and millions of tweets. And so that's the approach we went with, but if you have another suggestion, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to sort of cleanly weed those out, but I do think it makes a difference, right? Because I think some of the hashtags in particular are probably driven by interest groups or by politicians themselves and then get picked up and adopted.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's a part of your story. I don't think it undermines the great work that you've done, but I might address it in the paper.
Yeah, I'm thinking just off the top of my head, we could actually have RAs. We could take a couple thousand tweets and say, hey, code these, and just see what that percentage looks like just from a random sample. So thank you for that. I'll definitely pass that on.
Great. Loved the paper.
Thank you.
Jessica, I see that you've got a question for one of our panelists.
Yeah, I just I wanted to ask Reagan if this might be a completely different paper, so like make of it what you will. If you had looked at with the presidency, if there's a situational use for symbols. So we know from like a lot of the literature on presidential, say, war rhetoric, that then those symbols really matter and those symbols really pop. Whereas like the daily in and out press conferences don't, which is different from Congress, where like that's it, the everyday is the everyday with Congress. And the court, where they only have big events, you've actually got a president in the middle where both happen. So I was wondering if you had been able to tap into that or had thought about tapping into that at all.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and that's something I've thought about a bit. The focus of this paper is not so much about like the situational use of it, as you mentioned, but I have thought about how there are some kind of intentional uses versus like unintentional kind of like more daily sorts of uses. So I'm not as much focused on that, and that would definitely be a different paper. But absolutely, when you're talking about things like war rhetoric, absolutely, there's different situational cases where the president might want to invoke those symbols in order to invoke feelings of safety. So just anecdotally, a lot of my dissertation so far in this paper was written during the course of the pandemic. So I would often see like, okay, how many images of the White House are behind, President Trump as he's giving his press conference briefings, and you just see like this blue wall behind him just full of little White House symbols. That's just, so I think there are some where they're trying to invoke some kind of sense of safety and control to kind of make the public feel a little bit more comfortable, or like, like president's got it, president's in charge kind of thing. I think that when it comes to a later chapter in the dissertation, I think that there might be room for something where it's like there's a more situational use where there's versus something where there's a more intentional use, and that could imply dependent variables that include like whether or not that person feels like comfortable, or if they feel like the president's in charge, or they feel safer or secure about a particular situation. Thank you.
Other questions from audience members? Well, if not, then let's see. I'll wrap things up by saying thank you so much to our panelists for presenting some some awesome new research. Thank you to our discussant, Michael Nelson, for his willingness to review this work. And thanks to everybody who came out on this lovely June afternoon. We've got, as a reminder, we've got another panel prepared for July on, I believe it's immigration law, and tentatively we have a panel planned for later in the fall on state courts. So I would ask, please be on the lookout from one of your webmasters, either on Twitter or Facebook or the listserv for those announcements. And with that, I will also say we've been recording this, so I think our plan is to create a YouTube page where we will archive all these brown bags for your consumption sometime in the future. Okay, well, unless there's anything else, I think we'll adjourn, and I'll wish everybody a lovely day and weekend.
Thank you.